the silence of the room is not a sign of peace, but rather the held breath of a predator waiting to strike from the shadows. In the dead of night, when the world outside is asleep, the air inside a haunted home becomes heavy with static electricity and an oppressive weight that presses down on the chest. It starts with small sounds that logic tries to explain away, as the settling of old timber or the wind rattling the window panes. But then the impossible happens right before your wide eyes as a heavy oak chair slides across the floorboards without a human hand touching it. This is not the passive haunting of a residual memory playing out a tragedy from the past, but an active and violent intelligence. This is the terrifying reality of poltergeist activity, where unseen forces manipulate the physical world with terrifying strength. Poltergeist is a German word that translates literally to noisy ghost, and it represents one of the most physically dangerous categories of paranormal phenomena recorded in history. Unlike traditional apparitions that might simply walk through a wall or vanish into thin air, a poltergeist has the ability to interact with solid matter. These entities can throw objects across the room or slam doors with enough force to shatter the frames, and even physically assault the living inhabitants of a home. The energy required to lift a solid wood table or levitate a human body is immense, and suggests a source of power that science has yet to fully understand. Throughout history, these events have been documented with fear and fascination by those who have witnessed the impossible becoming reality. Our story takes us back to the autumn of the year 1896 in the isolated farming community of Blackwood Hollow, located deep in the rural heart of Pennsylvania. The landscape was dominated by dense forests of pine and oak that seemed to swallow the light of the sun long before evening officially arrived. The winding dirt roads were often washed out by heavy rains, making travel difficult and isolating the families who worked the land from the outside world. It was here that the Stone family lived, in a sprawling 2-story farmhouse that had been built by their ancestors nearly a century prior. The house was a sturdy structure of stone and timber, designed to withstand the harsh winters. But it was about to face a force far more destructive than any storm. Jeremiah Stone was a stern and hardworking man who demanded order and discipline from his wife Martha and their 3 children. He was a man of the earth who believed only in what he could see with his eyes and touch with his calloused hands. Religion played a central role in the household, with nightly scripture readings and a strict adherence to moral conduct. There was no room in the mind of Jeremiah for ghost stories or superstition, which he viewed as nonsense for the weak-minded. However, the conviction of his beliefs would be tested to the breaking point when the sanctity of his home was invaded by a chaotic entity that mocked his authority and terrified his family. The trouble began gradually, in the weeks leading up to the harsh winter solstice, with incidents that were easily dismissed as clumsiness or forgetfulness. Small items like sewing needles or thimbles would vanish from the work basket, only to reappear days later in impossible places like the inside of a sealed jar or balanced atop a high door frame. Martha Stone, a woman of infinite patience, initially blamed the children for playing pranks, although they vehemently denied any involvement. The atmosphere in the house began to change, shifting from the warm comfort of a family home to a cold and watchful environment where everyone felt like an intruder. The family dog, a large hunting hound that had never known fear, began to whine and refuse to enter the parlor. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, the activity escalated from mischievous displacements to audible disturbances that kept the family awake until dawn. It started with a rhythmic knocking sound that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, moving from room to room with intelligent purpose. Jeremiah Stone tore away sections of the wallpaper and inspected the plumbing, suspecting rats or settling pipes. But he found absolutely nothing that could explain the noise. The knocking would often mimic the rhythm of songs or repeat the number of knocks requested by the children, suggesting a conscious mind was behind the sounds. The fear in the household was palpable as they realized they were sharing their home with an invisible guest. The first undeniable display of kinetic force occurred during the evening meal on a Tuesday in late November. While the family was gathered around the dining table, the heavy iron chandelier that hung above them began to sway gently at first, and then with increasing violence until it was swinging in a wide arc. The candles flickered wildly, casting dancing shadows against the walls that looked like twisted figures writhing in pain. Suddenly, the heavy porcelain tureen filled with hot soup was lifted straight up into the air by invisible hands. It hovered for a breathless second before being hurled against the stone fireplace, where it shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The family sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the violation of natural law they had just witnessed. Following the destruction of the soup tureen, the activity became aggressive and focused particularly on the eldest daughter, 11-year-old Abigail Stone. Objects seemed to react to her presence, flying off shelves when she entered a room or sliding across the floor to block her path. At night, her bed would shake, violently tossing her from side to side like a rag doll, while her parents watched in helpless terror. Jeremiah Stone called for the local doctor, named Samuel Moore, hoping that his daughter was suffering from some nervous affliction that caused these spasms. Dr. Moore arrived with his medical bag and skepticism, but he would leave the Stone farmhouse with a pale face and shaking hands. During the examination by Dr. Moore, The bedroom of Abigail Stone became the center of a whirlwind of supernatural activity. The heavy wash basin stand dragged itself across the wooden floor with a grating sound that set their teeth on edge. A heavy wool blanket was ripped from the bed by an unseen force and tossed into the corner of the room in a crumpled heap. The doctor watched in disbelief as deep scratches appeared on the wooden headboard of the bed, as if carved by invisible claws. He declared that there was no medical explanation for what was happening and advised Jeremiah to seek spiritual counsel immediately. The man of science had been defeated by the impossible reality of the situation. News of the haunting spread through Blackwood Hollow like wildfire, despite the efforts of Jeremiah to keep the embarrassing situation private. Neighbors whispered about the cursed stone farm and avoided the road that passed by their property after dark. The isolation of the family deepened as they were shunned by the community they had been part of for generations. Within the walls of the farmhouse, the terror was relentless, with the entity growing stronger with each passing day. It began to manifest physical blows, slapping the family members and pulling their hair with painful force. The safe haven of their home had transformed into a prison of fear. Desperate for relief, Jeremiah Stone invited the Reverend Elias Thorne to the house to perform a blessing and cast out the evil spirit. Reverend Thorne was a fire and brimstone preacher who believed firmly in the literal existence of demons and the power of faith to repel them. He arrived at the farmhouse armed with his Bible and a vial of holy water, prepared to do battle with the forces of darkness. As soon as the Reverend stepped across the threshold, the house seemed to react with a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. The temperature in the hallway dropped nearly 20 degrees in an instant, causing their breath to mist in the freezing air. The exorcism attempted by Reverend Thorne in the parlor was a chaotic and terrifying scene that none present would ever forget. As he began to read passages of scripture in a loud, commanding voice, the activity in the room exploded into violence. Books flew from the shelves as if thrown by angry hands, striking the Reverend and the family members. The heavy oak table in the center of the room lifted several inches off the floor and slammed down repeatedly in a deafening rhythm. The Reverend shouted his prayers over the din, but his voice was drowned out by a cacophony of banging and scratching sounds that seemed to come from every direction at once. Suddenly, the Bible was slapped from the hands of Reverend Thorne and slid across the floor, disappearing under the heavy sofa. The holy water vial shattered in his pocket, soaking his coat and causing him to gasp in shock. A large, heavy mirror that hung over the mantelpiece detached itself from the wall and floated through the air for a moment before hovering directly in front of the preacher. With a sudden burst of force, it shattered mid-air, raining shards of glass down upon the group and forcing them to cover their heads for protection. Reverend Thorne fled the house, claiming that the devil himself had taken residence in the Stone family home. The failure of the religious intervention left the family without hope and completely vulnerable to the increasing rage of the poltergeist. The entity seemed emboldened by its victory over the preacher, and the attacks became more frequent and more dangerous. Large pieces of furniture, like wardrobes and dressers, were overturned, blocking doorways and trapping the family in rooms. Stones from the garden were hurled through the windows from the outside, shattering the glass and leaving the house exposed to the bitter winter wind. The family was living in a state of siege, with an enemy that could walk through walls and see in the dark. One particularly harrowing night, Jeremiah Stone decided to confront the entity directly, armed with a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He stood in the center of the parlor, shouting challenges into the empty air, demanding the spirit show itself and leave his family alone. His defiance was met with a terrifying display of power. As the lit logs from the fireplace were ejected onto the rug, Jeremiah frantically stomped out the flames, while the heavy curtains were ripped from the windows and wrapped around his head, attempting to suffocate him. He struggled against the suffocating fabric, finally tearing it free. But the message was clear. He was physically outmatched. The psychological toll on Abigail was devastating, as she felt responsible for the chaos that seemed to center around her. She became withdrawn and pale, refusing to eat or speak, and spending her days sitting in the corner of the kitchen. The entity seemed to feed off her fear and distress, using her energy to fuel its violent outbursts. Strange writing began to appear on the walls, written in soot or scratched into the plaster. The messages were gibberish at first, but soon formed cruel words and threats directed at the family. The handwriting was jagged and erratic, looking nothing like the penmanship of any human hand. As winter fully set in the snow piled high around the farmhouse, trapping the Stone family inside with their tormentor. The days were short and gloomy, and the nights were an eternity of terror as they huddled together in the main room for safety. Sleep was impossible, as the sounds of footsteps paced the floors above them, and doors slammed shut with explosive force. They could hear the sound of heavy breathing in the darkness right next to their ears. But when they lit a lamp, there was no one there. The line between nightmare and reality had completely dissolved. The climax of the haunting occurred during a blizzard in late January, when the poltergeist activity reached a fever pitch. The family was gathered in the kitchen, trying to stay warm near the stove, when the entire house began to shake, as if hit by an earthquake. Dishes exploded in the cupboards, and the cast iron stove lids danced and rattled with a deafening clamor. Suddenly, the kitchen table was flipped, overpinning Martha Stone against the wall. Jeremiah rushed to help her, but was knocked backward by an invisible blow to the chest that left him gasping for air on the floor. Abigail screamed as she was lifted into the air, her feet dangling 2 feet above the floorboards. She spun slowly, her arms flailing, as she tried to grab onto something solid to anchor herself. The other children huddled under the overturned furniture, crying in terror. As the kitchen was destroyed around them, flour and sugar canisters burst open, filling the air with a white cloud that made it difficult to see. Through the haze, objects flew with lethal velocity, embedding themselves in the wooden walls. It was a maelstrom of destruction that threatened to tear the house apart. In a final act of desperation, Jeremiah Stone managed to crawl to the back door and force it open against the howling wind. He shouted for his family to run to the barn, which was the only other shelter available to them. One by one, they scrambled out into the freezing blizzard, leaving the chaos of the house behind them. Martha dragged the younger children through the deep snow, while Jeremiah carried Abigail, who had been dropped to the floor when the door opened. They stumbled through the whiteout conditions, the wind biting at their exposed skin, until they reached the safety of the barn. Inside the barn, the animals were restless and frightened, sensing the unnatural energy that radiated from the house. The family huddled together in the hay, covering themselves with horse blankets to ward off the freezing cold. They watched through the cracks in the barn wood as the lights in the farmhouse flickered on and off rapidly. Shadows moved past the windows, not human shadows, but distorted and elongated shapes that seemed to prowl from room to room. The house itself seemed to be alive, pulsing, with a dark energy that was visible even through the storm. They survived the night in the barn, shivering and terrified, listening to the sounds of destruction coming from their home. When the sun finally rose, casting a pale gray light over the snow-covered landscape, the farmhouse stood silent. The front door hung off its hinges, and the windows were jagged maws of broken glass. The Stone family knew they could never spend another night under that roof. They gathered what few possessions they could salvage from the wreckage and loaded the wagon. They left Blackwood Hollow that very morning, never looking back at the home that had turned against them. The Stone farmhouse stood abandoned for decades, a rotting monument to the terror that had taken place within its walls. Locals claimed that on quiet nights you could still hear the sound of breaking glass and heavy furniture moving inside the empty shell. No one dared to enter the property, and the land around it went untilled and overgrown with weeds. The legend of the Blackwood Poltergeist became a cautionary tale told to children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. The story served as a grim reminder that there are forces in this world that are beyond our understanding and control. Poltergeist activity remains one of the most baffling mysteries of the paranormal world, challenging our understanding of physics and consciousness. Researchers have proposed many theories, from the projection of repressed telekinetic energy to the intrusion of interdimensional entities. The case of the Stone family is just one of thousands of reported incidents throughout history where the laws of nature are suspended by an unseen force. These events leave behind physical evidence and psychological scars that never fully heal. They force us to question the nature of reality and our place within it. The connection between poltergeist activity and adolescents, particularly young women like Abigail Stone, has been noted in many famous cases. This has led parapsychologists to theorize that the energy for these manifestations is drawn from the intense emotional turmoil of puberty. The human mind under stress may be capable of projecting force in ways we cannot yet measure or comprehend. If this theory is true, it suggests that the ghosts we fear may not be spirits of the dead, but rather monsters of our own creation. We may be haunting ourselves with the uncontrolled power of our own subconscious minds. However, there are aspects of poltergeist cases that defy the telekinesis theory, suggesting an independent intelligence at work. The writing of messages, the mimicry of sounds, and the targeted attacks on specific individuals point to a conscious entity. In the Stone case, the entity showed malice and strategic thinking, trapping the family and cutting off their escape. It reacted to religious provocation and mocked the attempts to stop it. This suggests a malevolent spirit that enjoys inflicting fear and pain rather than a simple release of psychic energy. The skeptical view holds that all such cases are elaborate hoaxes perpetrated for attention or financial gain. Yet in the case of the Stone family, they had nothing to gain and everything to lose by inventing such a story. They lost their home, their standing in the community, and their peace of mind. The sheer scale of the destruction and the number of witnesses, including the doctor and the reverend, makes the hoax theory difficult to maintain. It is hard to explain how an 11-year-old girl could flip a heavy oak table or throw a cast iron stove lid while under observation. Modern science still struggles to explain these phenomena, often dismissing them as hallucinations or mass hysteria. But mass hysteria cannot shatter a mirror or embed a knife in a wall. The physical evidence left behind by poltergeist activity demands an explanation that goes beyond psychology. Until science can account for these anomalies, they remain in the realm of the paranormal. We are left with the uncomfortable truth that there are invisible forces capable of manipulating our physical world. The lingering dread of a poltergeist haunting comes from the violation of our most basic sense of safety. Our homes are supposed to be our sanctuaries, where we are protected from the dangers of the outside world. When the danger comes from within the walls, from the very objects we use every day. There is nowhere left to hide. The trust we place in the physical stability of our reality is broken forever. We can never look at a swaying chandelier or a creaking door the same way again. As we conclude this dark journey into the history of the Stone family, let the silence of your own room settle around you. Listen closely to the small sounds of your house, settling the creak of the floorboard or the tap against the window. Ask yourself if it is just the wind, or if there is something unseen sharing the space, with you waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. The line between our world and the unseen is thinner than we like to believe, and sometimes that line is crossed with violent consequences. The story of the poltergeist is not just a ghost story, but a reminder of the fragility of our perceived reality. It challenges us to accept that we do not know everything about the universe we inhabit. There are shadows in the corners of our world where logic fails and fear takes over. So tonight, as you turn out the lights and lay your head down, remember the Stone family and the terror that drove them into the snow, and pray that the only thing moving in your house tonight is the air.